The Tom Woods Show, episode 608.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the show. Tomorrow's episode, remember, will be a debate review episode with Lou Rockwell. Today, I'm going to play for you a talk I gave back in 2011 in Kansas City. And it's about nullification, because I haven't talked about that in a while. So what the heck? You know, I did write a book on this in 2010 called Nullification, about the powers of the states to refuse to enforce unconstitutional federal laws. That got me into some trouble, but some fun trouble. And by the way, that book, of course, I have all my books available on my site or on Amazon or whatever, but there is an audiobook version for those of you who ask. I get emails a lot. Are your books available on audio? Some of them are. And Nullification certainly is. And if you haven't already, you can get a free audiobook. You can get Nullification for free as an audiobook through tomwoodsaudio.com. So I'm going to play this talk for you. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you're making your plans to join me on the Contra Cruise October 9th through 16th, 2016, because it's going to be great fun. And as Bob says, Bob Murphy, who's my co-host there, it's not like we're just going to be, sitting around the pool and hanging around together. It's much more than that. We got all kinds of fun activities planned for everybody. You're going to want to come every year after you get off this thing, because we're going to have so much fun. So check out the details about that at contracruise.com. All right, show notes for today, tomwoods.com/608. I'll have the Nullification book there. And maybe I'll also have my frequently asked questions about nullification. Let's put that there, too. Yeah. Because I get the same questions over and over and over again, and that's what an FAQ page is for. All right. Hope you enjoy it. Well, thank you very much. You guys are almost a hometown crowd for me now that I've moved to Topeka, Kansas 1 year ago. A tiny smattering of applause that elicits. It's interesting, I had Jason, and I'd like to thank Jason and the Foundation for a Free Society, and Michael Bolden, the 10th Amendment Center, and Bryce Shanka, and everybody who helped put this together, all the co-sponsoring organizations. I want to thank you. But I had Jason and Michael and a few of these guys over to our house a couple days ago. They got in town a little early for this event. Because one thing I learned is that when you move to Topeka, your out-of-town friends do not come visit. So, I knew they were coming to Kansas City. I said, you're coming to my house. And I kid you not, the one time we've had, in the year that we've lived here, the one time out-of-town friends show up, there's a storm that knocks out our power for 14 hours. All right, way to live up to the caricature of Kansas, right? The weather's insane, and that's exactly what they experienced. On the other hand, here I was all mortified. We've got no electricity. Then I turn around and I look, and we have huge windows in our living room, and of course we have the giant sky in Kansas. And they're just blown away by the fact that the sky is just flashing constantly, some kind of strobe light effect with the lightning. So I think that kind of made it okay. We got to experience something of Kansas, and thank goodness. But I'm happy to be here and to talk about this subject because in particular I know that in Missouri there has been tremendous support for this idea. Because earlier this year, there was a petition that went around that was signed by about 45 organizations throughout this state, and that included 9/12 groups and Tea Party groups and Campaign for Liberty and Young Americans for Liberty, and big organizations, Concerned Women for America, all kinds of different groups, urging the state legislative leadership to meet with me and talk about nullification. I mean, this is like something out of science fiction. Like 5 years ago, who would have expected that this would be actually on the table? So, as I'm sure you've gathered by now, the things we're talking about today are not things the New York Times wants us to talk about. So I want everybody to prepare yourselves. I don't want to disillusion you here. But these are ideas that you won't read about in the New York Times or in Newsweek. So this is really forbidden stuff. How dare we entertain these ideas? But that's the beauty of this. That's the beauty of this whole meeting, is that we don't care. We're not going to limit ourselves to the narrow range of choices that the New York Times and the Washington Post offer us. They are our enemies. They're not going to give us choices that are going to work for us. Why should we allow ourselves to be confined in our options by them? No, to the contrary, we are living in this country in a tiny box. They've boxed us into a container that's, well, I was making it look bigger than it is. It's really like this big. It's about this big, and that container contains all the opinions you are allowed to hold. If you hold any opinion that doesn't fall into that box, well, then you'll be smeared and condemned, and obviously you're an extremist, because after all, if your opinions don't fall somewhere between Joe Biden and Mitt Romney, there must be something wrong with you, right? By definition, all respectable opinion is right in that 3 inches. And what we are doing here, and encouraging you to do, is to crush that box into the ground and set it on fire. Now, you folks have been very patient. I'm always in awe of people who take an entire Saturday and say, yes, I would like to attend a constitutional seminar during my Saturday. Yes! That is serious awesomeness right there. So I'm not going to go over a whole lot of common ground, but I do want to give just a basic overview of some of the ideas that you've been hearing over the course of the day, and then expand on them. And in particular, what I'm talking about, of course, are what are known as the principles of 98. 98, of course, a reference to the seminal year 1798, when 2 of the most important yet consistently overlooked documents in all of American history, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, were drafted by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, respectively. Now, I once explained to my 8-year-old, who was then 7, what the concept of nullification was. And I did that because she's 8 going on 58. She's reading, like last year when she was 7, she read Little Women, like the whole book. Like, this is not a normal kid in a good way, you know what I mean? She amazes me, and I know you're all sick of, oh, here's another father bragging about his kids. I'm sorry about that. But she really is unbelievable, and she blows me away constantly, but she wants to know what's in her daddy's books, right? She's read, look, I just read Little Women. How hard could nullification be? Come on. So she wants to know, and I keep saying to her, you know, you got to be a little bit older, and then maybe I think you could grasp it. And one night, she had just had it up to here with Daddy's excuses, and she said, no, I want you to try. I want you to try to explain it. So I did. And I just went like this. So I explained to her about what the government is, and I said, so what they decided to do was that I thought it would be dangerous if these people could just do anything they wanted. So what they decided to do was to compile a list of things they could do. And I kid you not, she said, but what if they do something that's not on the list? I told you, she gets right to the heart of things. And I said, well, that's what nullification is. That's when the states say, now, wait a minute, that's not on the list, so we're not doing it. And she thought that seemed just and fair. So I thought that makes her better than the whole Supreme Court. Now, the principles of 98 can be summed up very simply. The federal government is a government of limited enumerated powers. That is to say, it has a list of powers. Article 1, Section 8 is where you can find them. The states delegated those powers to the federal government. The states came before the federal government in the same way that the bride and groom come before the marriage. The states were there first. They enjoyed a reservoir of power by virtue of the fact that their peoples are sovereign. The peoples of the states are sovereign, and those peoples apportion their sovereign powers, granting some of them, or delegating some of them to the state governments and others to the federal government in the Constitution. When the federal government attempts to exercise a power that has not been delegated to it, therefore, that attempted exercise of power is null and void and of no force. That's what the principles of 98 say. What they're all about, ultimately, is coping with the fact that the federal government is not going to limit itself, has absolutely no incentive to limit itself. You notice that we say a lot that, boy, the federal government just doesn't abide by the 10th Amendment. It just won't obey the 10th Amendment. But do you notice that we never sit around and say, the federal government just won't obey the 16th Amendment. It just refuses to collect income taxes. What's wrong with this thing? Well, of course, it has no reason not to want to enforce that amendment. Sure. Give us some dough? Of course we're going to enforce that. But what incentive does it have to say, now, wait a minute, sure, we could exercise a whole lot of power, but we'd rather not. We'd rather leave that to the states. I mean, really. You're going to need something other than the federal government itself to do the limiting. Now, we sometimes hear we could sue the federal government in the courts, and that'll solve our problems. Now, once in a great while, that might solve your problem. In the same way that if you and I were having a dispute, and I said, I have just the person to resolve this dispute for us, my mother. Well, look, my mother's a very decent woman. She's fair-minded. Once in a while, she might even side with you. But I wouldn't wager a whole lot of money on that. So likewise, if one of the branches of the federal government is going to adjudicate the dispute, I think we more or less know how that's going to turn out, especially today. When you think about who's sitting in these courts, well, products of the current law school system in the United States, where they are taught that the central organizing principle of the American Republic is that the federal government dominates every competing power center and the states sit back and take it. That's what they're taught. That's what they're taught as, quote, constitutional law. Now, constitutional law has nothing to do with the Constitution. And I say that not to be facetious. You can take a course in constitutional law at a law school, and you will not read the Constitution, and you will not read anything about the history of the Constitution. You won't read anything about the state ratifying conventions, which is where James Madison says we must refer ourselves when we want to understand the meaning of the document those people ratified. You're not going to read any of that. You're going to read a whole bunch of court cases, and you'll become an expert on a whole lot of court cases. But the point is, if you don't know the historical background, how are you going to know if the cases were correctly decided? Maybe you're learning and memorizing a whole bunch of crackpot decisions. That's possible. My colleague, Kevin Gutzman, who wrote a book called The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution, makes this point, because Kevin's got a PhD in history and he's got a law degree. So the lawyers are terrified to debate him because he knows so much history. The historians are terrified to debate him because he knows so much law. So he gets an awful lot of work done because nobody bothers him. But that's his consistent point. In fact, Gutzman told me that if you're studying for the bar exam, a lot of times people will take crash courses to study for the bar exam, and there's a multiple choice section. And you are told, as a test-taking tip in these crash courses, that when you are going through the multiple choice section, if you come across a question, one of whose possible multiple choice responses is the 10th Amendment, that's never the right answer. You can just cross that off. That's never right. The 10th Amendment is always wrong on the bar exam. Now, for Thomas Jefferson, the 10th Amendment was the cornerstone of the whole Constitution. But, of course, he didn't have the benefit of studying under 20th and 21st century law professors, so what did he know? But Jefferson's view was that the Constitution was written so that the average person could get it, that we don't need this sort of separate race of human beings who will disclose to us what the true meaning is. No! I mean, this is exactly what makes you not a free people, is to live under something like that. So where'd this idea of nullification come from? I mean, we can see the logical attractiveness of it, that a government is not going to limit itself, and it makes sense that since the states created the federal government, the states have a particular constitutional role to play. Well, it seems logical that they should play some kind of limiting role. Where'd this come from? Was Jefferson just drunk one day and then he drafted it, and then the next day he had already sent it out to the legislature and then he regretted it. I mean, where did it come from? And it turns out that we can trace it back at least 10 years earlier to the Virginia Ratifying Convention of 1788. Now, Virginia is the most important, influential state early on, a very populous state. Of course, you can think of all the great statesmen that come to us from Virginia. And at that ratifying convention, you had some skeptics. Should we ratify this thing? Patrick Henry was one of these skeptics. Now, this is some of you who have watched me talk about this on YouTube. I know this is familiar ground, but I'm always talking to new audiences, and I feel like the stand-up comic who, in the age of YouTube, feels like he has to have a new routine every night, but how could he do this all the time? I mean, it is the same ideas, after all, but I do want to at least cover this particular ground the same way, because at that ratifying convention, Patrick Henry was warning that there were loopholes in the Constitution. He said, look at this general welfare clause. Federal government can do what it wants on behalf of the general welfare. He said, whoa, whoa, whoa. I mean, every tyrant who ever lived claimed that his oppressions were for the general welfare. This is going to come back to bite us, you know where. And the response was from the Federalists. That is, these are the people, the Federalists was a name given to those who supported the Constitution in the ratifying conventions. Federalists said, no, don't worry about this. No, this is a limited government. So we have to understand those phrases in that context, that if you're thinking about the general welfare, yeah, well, when the federal government is exercising the powers that are given to it, it has to exercise those with an eye to the general welfare. It does not mean, here are all the powers we're giving you, plus anything you think might help, you could also do. We are not saying that. And in particular, there was a 5-man commission that was appointed to draft the official instrument by which Virginia would ratify the Constitution. And in that instrument, they would say, you know, Virginia is officially ratifying the Constitution, but also here is the sense in which Virginia understands the document. And on that commission, we had, among other people, Edmund Randolph, who became the first Attorney General of the country. We had George Nicholas, who became the first Attorney General of Kentucky. These are serious legal minds, and they were saying, it was Randolph who said, don't worry, this is a limited government. The federal government is going to have only the powers expressly delegated to it. He used the words expressly delegated. Not, well, you could maybe infer they were delegated if you draw a maze through the Constitution connecting some of the words. No, only if the power is expressly delegated. And then we have George Nicholas, who said that if the federal government tries to reach for any additional power, Virginia will be exonerated from the exercise of that power, because we never agreed to be bound by that. We're agreeing only to be bound by the powers listed in the Constitution. Now that is pretty darn close to nullification and the principles of 98. And as I say, these are not just a couple of yahoos that I just picked at random who just happened to stumble in drunk to the ratifying convention. I mean, these are future attorneys general who were drafting the document that would explain the meaning of the Constitution as Virginia understood it. Now, this sort of stuff that I'm just covering here, this is all available in primary sources. This isn't something that I conjured up out of thin air. And this is all stuff that you can find in the book that I wrote on this called Nullification. It's all in there. But you're not going to hear about this in a classroom. Moreover, James Madison, in his famous Report of 1800, addressed the objection, well, the courts will put everything right. He basically made clear that our system does not hold that legislators can be fallible, presidents can be fallible, but our judges are divine. That is not the nature of our system. He said, to the contrary, there has to be, in the last resort, when all 3 branches have betrayed us, there has to be some last resort mechanism of defense for the states. He called them the parties to the Constitution, which is exactly what they are, logically and historically. That's what Madison said in the Report of 1800. Again, we're not making this stuff up. Now, you talk about this, anytime you talk about the states, you already know, I'm sure some of you have been through this just as I have. The first sort of thing they're going to say is, oh, this was probably just some clever rationalization of slavery. The southern states probably invented this doctrine as a way of defending the slave system. Well, as you heard today, nothing could be further from the truth. And a lot of times people say nothing could be further from the truth. And they don't really mean that. I mean, really, when you say nothing could be further from the truth, you mean like up and down could not be further from each other. But I really mean nothing could be further from the truth than to say nullification was used to defend slavery. It was used to fight against slavery, as you've seen today. And in fact, what in the world would the southern states have needed to nullify regarding slavery? Federal law was perfectly friendly to slavery. What would they have needed to nullify? The argument doesn't even make sense. I mean, I know, again, I hate to break this to you, but Rachel Maddow is making an argument that does not make sense. So brace yourselves. Or, well, isn't this some kind of neo-Confederate doctrine? Because we all know that means evil and all that. But in fact, what's interesting about the Principles of 98 is that they're not a Southern doctrine and they're not a Northern doctrine. They're an American doctrine. And another point of this book is to dig up history that, again, is long forgotten, showing how Northern states engaged in this process. And in fact, it was the Confederate president, future Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, when he gave his farewell speech to the U.S. Senate, he condemned nullification. South Carolina, when it seceded December 20th, 1860, one of their grievances was we're sick and tired of the North nullifying. Now, this isn't anything you're going to hear in Rachel Maddow. She doesn't know any of this. But we need to, because this makes people's heads spin when they hear this. And why does it make their heads spin? Because nobody is taught this, right? And we have just sort of come to accept it that, well, the schools teach propaganda, and what can you do about it? It is about time we stopped putting up with that, right? Now, one thing I did to sort of fight back against this, because I knew the sort of, you write a book called Nullification, and you stamp the word over the faces of Obama and Pelosi and Joe Biden and the whole host of horrors here, you know what they're going to say. Oh, well, obviously, you've got some racial animus or whatever. Like, you can't ever have an honorable disagreement with the left, right? There's always some sinister motive. So, yeah, so the whole thing's absurd, of course. But so what I did was, and now I know nothing about cameras and multimedia and whatever. The only talent I have is writing. And I mean that literally. That's not false modesty. I've never changed a tire. I don't know how to fix my plumbing. I don't know. This is it. This is all I've got. So I got to defend this. I've got to defend the integrity of my work before the evil people come and try and tear it down. So what I did was I did get people who do know about multimedia, and I made a little promo video for the book. And the video is called Interview with a Zombie. And a few of you have seen that. Thank you. For those of you in here who use the internet, I would like to give you a homework assignment. This is your action item for today. In addition to supporting all the groups that help make this possible, I want you to go to a website. I purchased this domain name, interviewwithazombie.com. Can you believe that was available? I snatched it up for $7. And that way I don't have to say, hey, go look at my video. Go to YouTube, then type it. No. Just go to interviewwithazombie.com. And first of all, you'll notice, by the way, that the blooper tape from my video is also up there, which is 10 times funnier than the actual video, it turns out. But the idea of Interview with a Zombie was that I'm being interviewed for a television talk show hosted by an actual zombie. So I had a friend of mine, an economist actually. I'm sure there's a joke there, right? I mean, I'm not even going to... So he dressed up as a zombie, jumped at the chance, by the way, to dress up as a zombie. The market is not so good for economists these days, so he was only too happy to do this. And the idea of the show is he's a zombie, and all he can do is say, we decided he can say only one word at a time. And he's going to interview me about my book, Nullification. So the first word of the interview is, he holds up the book and says, book. And so then I kind of look around and I explain what the book is about, and then he starts doing what the left would do. He starts throwing these sort of career-destroying smears at me. You know, slavery. And then I have to say, well, you know, actually nullification was never used for slavery, whatever. And then it's neo-Confederate, which is that's like their worst word they can think of to use against you. So they use that one. So the zombie is using that, and racism, because the only reason you would ever want decentralized government is to oppress people, because centralized governments have never oppressed anybody, apparently. So that's all he's, and it doesn't matter. The point of the video is no matter how substantive my responses are, his follow-up question is always just another smear word. He never addresses the substance of my arguments. But he has an excuse. He's a zombie. What's Rachel Maddow's excuse? Now, you may say she's also a zombie, and I agree, that would explain a lot. But now this thing got all around the internet, and it was so beautifully done, and I had a professional voiceover guy do the beginning sequence, "Welcome to Interview with a Zombie." It was just perfect, right? And so now, anytime somebody addresses nullification without answering the arguments on their merits, but instead throwing out these phony baloney arguments that we've replied to millions of times, people call them zombies now. People will say, oh, there's another zombie attack on nullification. This is actually picked up. It's incredible. So that now there'll be some crazy left-wing thought control site like Think Progress or Media Matters, these thought controllers who want to shut down all debate in the country by intimidating people into silence. That's hard to do with me. I mean, at this point, I'm all out there at this point anyway. What more could they say about me they haven't already said? So it doesn't work on me. But in the comments section of their articles, half the people are saying, zombie, hey, you zombie, why don't you answer the argument on its merits, you zombie, zombies. And these people have no idea what in the world is going on here. It's great. It totally turns the tables on them. Now, I do want to say, now, at the risk of sounding like some kind of ego case, I get up here, oh, what is this guy just hawking a book or whatever? You know, if I really wanted to make money, I would write things that say what the regime wants to hear, okay? But you don't make a whole lot of money saying the exact opposite. This is not about money, although my 4 children need to eat and all that stuff. But I do want to say that one thing that I did do with this book, and also in the promo literature for this, Michael Bolden said I would be talking about the book, so I feel like I can get away with it without seeming like a crazy ego case. But the second half of it is documents from U.S. history showing you don't have to take my word for this. And in fact, by the way, I encourage you, go through the footnotes, see if I've misquoted anybody, see if I've taken anybody out of context. I would love to see somebody just go through and verify that I'm not lying about this. This is just stuff that's fallen down the Orwellian memory hole. But the second half is documents, like a Connecticut governor from the early 19th century saying that the states have to be the sentinels of the liberties of the people, or the legislature of Wisconsin supporting the Supreme Court, State Supreme Court of Wisconsin in fighting against the Fugitive Slave Act, or over and over and over. It's all there, stuff that we are not given, right? We never read this stuff. But the thing that I'm the proudest of in that section is if you don't read the primary sources in the book, I'll be disappointed, but at least read the document by the Virginia judge Abel Upshur, U-P-S-H-U-R. Abel Upshur is in here. I forget which chapter it is, but you'll see it. Upshur, who wrote in the 1830s, is one of the most unjustly neglected legal minds of the 19th century. And Upshur wrote the most persuasive pamphlet on behalf of nullification that I've ever read. And how did I found an original copy from 1833. How did I find that? I was doing some research in the Columbia University Library, and I stumbled upon a folder filled with old pamphlets in it. So curious, I opened it up. There's this thing by Upshur I'd never seen before. And then I did some research. It was reprinted 2 years later in a magazine in 1835. And then it had not ever seen the light of day ever since. And of course, the students at Columbia University were not exactly beating the doors down to get a copy of this pamphlet on nullification, which is the great thing about studying and writing about things that are not officially approved among the range of allowable opinion, is that the books you need are always there on the shelf. No one's taken them out. I didn't have any problem finding this thing. So I got this thing and I photocopied it, and I thought, this is incredible. And I thought, someday I'll have an opportunity to do something with this. Now it's in here. It's here forever. And I'm telling you, you'll read this and say, this is the most persuasive argument for nullification I've ever seen. It addresses all the objections. I wonder why we don't read about it in our history books. Well, I leave the answer to that question to the student as an exercise. Now, the best part of nullification, to me, is precisely that it involves thinking outside this box. That's what is best about it. Because thinking inside the box is what got our country to where it is now. And if we just keep on doing the same old thing, probably we're going to get the same old results. Probably that's just going to keep on happening. So maybe we have to think differently. And again, who cares about human respect? And gee, the editorial page of the New York Times won't like me. Well, you know what, I'll tell you. The best thing that ever happened to me was in early 2005, the New York Times editorial page attacked me by name because they did not like my book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History, which was on their bestseller list. They hated every minute of that. So they condemned it. How dare he say these things? And notice, again, they don't refute you. At no time did they say his argument is wrong because of X, Y, or Z. When you break out of that box, they don't even feel obligated to refute you. It's enough to show that you're outside that box. Only crazy people are outside that box. All the sane people are inside the box. Howard Dean and John Kerry and all these, those are that's all you need. So they didn't even need to refute me. Well, of course, what do you think happened to sales the week that the New York Times condemned me? I mean, of course, just like this, right? It's the best thing that ever happened to me. It could be the best thing that ever happened to you. People wrote to me and said, it's like you just won the Pulitzer Prize. They ignored me after that. The New York Times has just ignored me after that, which makes sense, I suppose. But we have got to get people in the habit of thinking in new and unapproved ways, and nullification does that. That's an end in itself as a part of nullification. And I hope that for some of you people, nullification will be like what's sometimes called a gateway drug. Like nullification, you start nullifying, you think, man, I sure enjoy standing up to the federal government, and maybe it'll snowball. Like, gee, I don't believe the federal government when it tells me that it has the power to tell the states what to do on X, Y, and Z. I don't believe them on that. Maybe we'll stop believing them on a lot of other things. That's good. We have to think in new and unapproved ways, unless we just want to see the country keep going down the tubes. We've got to keep questioning more and more, because we are constantly given fake choices. So one fake choice would be, should the federal government force the states to do A, or should it force the states to do B? That's a fake choice. Or the other fake choice would be, like if you're listening to commentary on the economy, another fake choice would be, well, what kind of stimulus program do we need? Do we need this kind of stimulus or that? Do we need to print a lot of money, or do we just need to borrow a lot of money? That's what I mean by a fake choice. That's a box that needs to be crushed. The stimulus programs are not the solution to our problems. The stimulus is the problem. On my site, I have a website, tomwoods.com, and it's no longer, I don't think it's on the front page anymore, but I did do a blog post last week or so, and the blog post listed about 16 different forms of stimulus, and it still didn't get all of them. 16 different forms of stimulus that we've seen over the past 10 years. And it's stimulus to everything, stimulus to the banks and to home building or to car purchases or to money market mutual funds or just whatever it is. Stimulus, stimulus, stimulus. That's what we've gotten. And where has it gotten us? And the whole thing got started with stimulus to begin with. Let's stimulate the housing market in 2001. That's what I talk about in Meltdown, is that this was the problem. What stimulates the housing market is when people decide to buy houses, not when they print up a lot of money and throw it at housing. This is what I mean, that we're being given these false choices. Which kind of... What would have to happen? How bad would the economy have to get for these geniuses to admit that maybe the problem hasn't been not enough stimulus, maybe the problem is these alleged remedies themselves? Or which policy should the Federal Reserve follow? Should it print up this much or that much money? Should it lower interest rates down to here or even further down to here? That's a false choice, and we get this constantly. Why? What is it about the economy that requires a Soviet-style central planning agency dictating interest rates in the first place? That's what causes our problems. These are boxes we need to break out of. But what's more, we need to break out of the whole version of history that we've been taught. The version of history that we've been taught that has led nullification to have a kind of toxic sense in people's minds is that centralization of power is a progressive force. And people who favor decentralization are stupid troglodytes who want to hold back progress. And in that video you saw, I mentioned the world historic significance of this issue of centralization versus decentralization. And centralization has brought us the worst atrocities that have ever been seen in history. The moral benefit of the doubt belongs to the decentralizers. We have to break out of this version of world history and this version of American history that teaches us that centralization of power is a good thing. The other aspect of history that we need to get out of, and this is, I'm sorry, one more thing. I have this book, Rollback, that deals with this. What I want to roll back is not just the government budget. I want to roll back the propaganda that makes people think this budget is sensible, that makes people think, oh gosh, if we ever cut back, if the federal government ever went back to what you people consider constitutional limits, where would we be? Well, you know, our kids would all be working in a mine for 3 cents a day, and we'd all get our limbs blown off because our computer monitors would be exploding in our faces, and everyone would be dying from poisoned food, and we wouldn't have any art because there'd be nobody to fund it. If there's no Joe Biden, no one's going to paint any pictures, and there won't be any, like all this, right? I mean, and I understand the superficial plausibility of that. But what I'm arguing is that all of this is a misconception, it's a misunderstanding of history. This is not the case. The federal government has not solved these problems. To the extent that they've been solved largely because of the private sector for reasons that I explained. But we're not going to make progress as long as even some of us in this room may have sort of carelessly bought into some of this propaganda. Well, you know, I'm against the federal government doing X, Y, or Z, but where would we be if they weren't doing this, this, and this? Well, I'm trying to answer that question of where we would be, and we would be freer and much more prosperous. We would not have this albatross around our necks. We wouldn't have had this crisis that we continue to endure. But these are the types of things that we need to emancipate ourselves from. All these sorts of things that that distract us from the real solutions to our problems. The media, in short, has put us into ideological prison camps where we are confined to debating issues along the narrow range that our wise overlords have established for us. That, oh good heavens, I better not be to the left of Hillary Clinton or to the right of Bob Dole, or the earth will break free of its axis and go spinning toward the sun. We can't have that. We are stuck on in these ideological prison camps. But these are unusual prison camps because these camps have no guns, they have no guards, they have no gates, they have no guard dogs. The only thing keeping us there is ourselves. As long as we play by their rules and we confine ourselves to the choices and to the version of history laid out for us by the New York Times, we will never be free. But if we think about, albeit a more dramatic example, the case of the Soviet Union, which was a place where it seemed completely hopeless to many people that there would ever be any type of change. And yet what happened? Was it that the Soviet Union ran out of bullets to mow down all the protesters? I mean, what exactly happened? It was ultimately that and all throughout Eastern Europe, the people just wouldn't follow orders anymore. They just wouldn't do it. They wouldn't be kicked around anymore. And ultimately, when the mass of the public says we're not going to be treated like this anymore, things do change. Because the people responsible for putting us in this situation are a small minority. We are the majority. We're the people. We're the ones ruled. Yeah. When our opinions change, regimes fall or change. And it can happen peacefully, simply by the withdrawal of consent. I no longer consent to be intimidated by your phony version of history, to be bossed around by you in ways entirely unlawful and immoral. We need to think in this way. In other words, it's all in our own hands. We have it in our own hands to break free of these shackles. For as Lord Byron said, who would be free themselves must strike the blow. Thank you very much. All right, everybody. Remember, you can get the audiobook version of Nullification for nothing at tomwoodsaudio.com. Tomorrow, it's Lou Rockwell joining us. Then next week, we got a bunch of great people. We got Peter Schiff coming back. He's going to answer some listener questions. I got a bunch of questions from the Supporting Listeners Facebook group. And I'm hoping to get a very, very special guest for next week. But I got to fiddle around with that a little bit. I don't want to make any promises yet. But it's going to be a great week. But anyway, I don't know why I'm thinking ahead to next week. Let's think ahead to tomorrow. We're going to have some fun talking about this debate. So we'll see you tomorrow.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.